Hello, I'm Clinton Campbell with the U.S. Department of Agriculture, stationed in Olympia, Washington. Today I will be sharing some success stories in invasive species management, pests and disease programs that USDA has. And you'll notice the two highlights. They are two of the four invasives that I mentioned on the previous slide. Next slide, please. In this display, we see some representations of the moth Lymantria dispar. And on the left are the Asian forms of the moth. And on the right are the European forms of the moth. And in the middle, lowest in the picture, is a egg mass of this particular species. Next slide, please. The European form of this moth was brought into the United States in 1869 with the intention to try to create a silk industry by crossing this moth with some native North American moths, which did not work and really could not have worked. But the moths got loose in a storm and have been spreading ever since on their own since 1869 in the areas shown in the various colors. This moth, however, is also a very good hitchhiker when eggs are laid on various things that can move across the country. And this is one of the reasons why at least the European form is of great concern to us. Next slide, please. And here is a perhaps better representation of what the moths look like. On the left is the male, which is fully flight capable. And on the right is the female, which in the European form, even though wings are present, the moth is not capable of flying. And in this picture on the right, what we see is the moth laying eggs, or what we refer to as the egg mass. Next slide, please. In the photo on the left, what we see are egg masses that are in the process of hatching. And what will happen is that these small caterpillars will climb up the tree, let out a line of silk. It gets caught by the wind and they can travel varying distances. And this is the chief way in which the European form spreads on its own, again, because only the male moth adult is capable of flying. On the right is a picture of the full-grown caterpillar, and it has very distinctive markings. We do not have it here. Next slide, please. I mentioned that we do not have Lymantria dispar here, and that's good because this is an important pest to forests. Defoliation events can weaken forests, increase the potential for damage by other forest pests, and have cascading effects. For example, larval outbreaks of this insect can bring about riparian or streamside defoliation, which in turn can cause a decrease in stream shading, which in turn can cause an increase in stream temperatures, and then it can affect fish and other aquatic fauna. Next slide, please. Back east in the permanently infested area shown on the earlier map, this is the kind of thing that can be seen from ground level during an infestation and a defoliation event. Next slide, please. And this is what defoliation looks like back east. And this, of course, is what we would like to prevent out here. And we have prevented it, as I'll describe in more detail. Next slide, please. Following the escape of these moths back in the late 1800s, it took a while for them to demonstrate their damage potential. And so there were efforts at the time made to try to get rid of what they could. On the left-hand side of this slide, you'll see people examining trees for egg masses to remove. And on the right, you'll see attempts to spray trees to deal with the caterpillars. Next slide, please. It would appear that in some cases, these efforts went to extremes. I suspect these photos were rather staged, but nonetheless are evidently actual photos of people looking for egg masses back many years ago. Next slide, please. Clearly, trying to search for signs of this moth by hand, by climbing trees and such, was not very satisfactory. And fortunately, about 50 plus years ago, a trap and a very effective lure were developed to detect this moth. Next slide, please. The male moth of Lymantria dispar is attracted to the lure in these traps, and is shown on end here. A small opening in the trap allows for the male to land on the trap and climb into the interior. Next slide, please. This is a trap that's been opened up, and on the right top portion here, you'll see the little string-like structure, which is a lure. It's a synthetic lure mimicking the chemistry of the female moth, and so it attracts the male moth. And then the lower two panels, middle and lower, are covered with sticky material, and the middle panel there is actually the bottom of the trap when hung, and you can see that a number of insects have made their way into the trap and gotten stuck. In this case, there are no actual Lymantria dispar moths, but we'll see in a moment something different. Next slide, please. And here is a trap used in this state to catch these moths, and what you'll notice here is very clearly there's a Lymantria dispar moth in this particular trap. So we have a very effective trap, and that's part of the reason that we've had success in keeping this particular moth from becoming established here. Next slide, please. In situations where a large number of these moths are trapped, and it looks like there's a beginning population, it allows workers to go in and check an area for any signs of egg masses being laid by the moth. And in this particular picture, this was taken in Clark County. On the left is a tree with an egg mass circled, and on the right is a tire that has an egg mass that was laid inside of the tire. So again, the trapping allows us to zero in on where the population is starting to develop. Next slide, please. So in addition to having a very effective trap, we also have a variety of tools to actually deal with the insect once we find a beginning population. And one of the tools that we're able to use, depending on the circumstances, is aerial application of an insecticide that is a bacterium that is naturally occurring, that when eaten by the caterpillars after being sprayed on the foliage, kills the caterpillars. And the good part is that it really only affects caterpillars. Next slide, please. The next program pest and success that I'd like to cover has to do with Phytophthora ramorum. And this is a water mold that's an invasive pathogen. It can infect over 100 different plant species, and it has killed millions of trees, primarily tan oaks and coast live oaks in coastal California and southern Oregon. Next slide, please. It also causes twig and foliar diseases in several common nursery and landscape plants, such as rhododendron. There is no cure for the disease that's caused by Phytophthora ramorum. However, preventing the movement of infected plants and materials is the best way to protect our forests and landscape plants. Next slide, please. Phytophthora ramorum has been a problem which started in California, and it's been a problem there for over 25 years. And in this particular photo, you see an aerial view of many dead trees that are brought about by this pathogen. Next slide, please. Part of the reason that we're certainly concerned around here about not having Phytophthora ramorum enter into the forests is because here's an example of some of the native plants that are known to be host plants for the pathogen, and so could be attacked. And of course, these are important in a variety of ways. Next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier, this pathogen was first found in California around 25 years ago or so. And so there were a lot of surveys being done, and it was found that it had entered some of the nursery plants even in California. And so this prompted nursery surveys in other coastal states. And during initial stages of a national survey for sudden oak death, again caused by Phytophthora morum. Oregon found the pathogen associated in a nursery with rhododendron. And then a sister nursery facility in this state was sampled in mid-June of 2003, and Phytophthora morum was likewise found on rhododendron. And so this meant that the pathogen had made the jump from California forest lands into nurseries, both there and in neighboring states. Next slide, please. So part of the focus then turned to nurseries and plants there that could be susceptible to this pathogen. And here's a picture from a nursery in this state that certainly had a water problem and had tested positive for Phytophthora morum in a number of the plants. And given that this is a water mold, this rather extreme water situation understandably made a problem even worse. Next slide, please. Recognizing that Washington and Oregon produce a lot of nursery plants, of course, we wanted to try to make sure that the pathogen hadn't moved on nursery stock coming from these states to Alaska. And so in some of the early years in the 2000s in Alaska, we surveyed plant nurseries which received a large amount of their stock from Washington and especially Oregon. And fortunately, we did not find any sign of the pathogen there. Next slide, please. And here's an example of some rhododendron leaves that were collected from a Alaska nursery and tested, but fortunately found negative, as all the samples ever taken from Alaska have. Next slide, please. So fortunately, through a lot of survey and testing, and in a number of cases with nurseries, steps taken to eradicate the pathogen from the existing stock and incorporate cleanup measures and things like that at these nurseries, we've been able to keep the pathogen from making the jump from the nursery into the open environment. The only thing that even came close is we did have a salal plant in a ditch across the road from a particular nursery that had tested positive. This salal plant had been tested positive, but fortunately everything was able to be removed and there's been no problems further with this. So the APHIS program has tended to focus on certainly nurseries and the movement of plants to prevent the spread of this disease further. And at least in this state, we've again managed to keep the pathogen out of the forest lands and out of the native plants. And there's been a number of response protocols to how nurseries are dealt with and so on. And again, the testing and other things has been focused on that. And so movement of plants from nurseries is keyed on to make sure that things do not get outside of nursery environments. And we've again been successful in keeping that as the case. Next slide, please. I'd next like to talk about a local success story involving the citrus longhorn beetle. And this slide talks a little bit about the Asian longhorn beetle because they're very closely related insects. And the Asian longhorn beetle was found in a number of eastern states quite a number of years ago, and in some cases is still being worked on, but in other cases the beetle has been eradicated from trees back in those particular states. And the way that the beetles got in was through solid wood packing material from Asia, involving things like pallets and crating and other structures used to support products when they're shipped from overseas. Next slide, please. And this is a picture or two of the citrus longhorn beetle, again, a very close relative of the better known Asian longhorn beetle. And we fortunately, again, have been able to keep that insect out of the state here from becoming established, but it has an interesting history, which I'll talk about here next. Next slide. In 2001, we actually had two nurseries here that turns out had plant material that had been brought in from Asia that had the citrus longhorn beetle inside of the plants. One was a nursery in Lacey, Washington, and another was a nursery in Tukwila, Washington. And in the case of the Tukwila nursery, the plants were being held under a post-entry quarantine to monitor them to make sure there weren't any diseases associated with the plants. And it turned out that despite inspections and other efforts earlier, these plants actually had 8 citrus longhorn beetles in them, which completed their development and tunneled out of the plants, chewed their way out of the plants, and were spotted by the nursery people in some situations as the beetles were flying across the street from the nursery into a neighboring greenbelt. Next slide, please. This is one of the bonsai maple trees at the nursery in Tukwila that shows the exit hole created by the adult beetle when it chewed its way out of the bonsai tree. And again, some of these were seen flying away across the road into a neighboring greenbelt. Next slide, please. And here is that greenbelt area across the street from the nursery. The nursery is just outside of the frame of this picture to the left. And in the top, you see again the greenbelt, lots of trees there. Quite a number of these trees were determined to be potential hosts of the beetle in which they could lay their eggs and then start a new generation on site. And so again, this was happening in 2001. And then the bottom slide, by the end of summer 2002, we had been able to remove the trees that were potential hosts of the beetle and then monitored the site for 5 years visually. And fortunately, nothing was ever found. So we were very successful in keeping the citrus longhorn beetle from actually becoming established here. Next slide, please. The last success story I want to share has to do with the cereal leaf beetle. And this is not exactly new, although it was detected in Washington and Oregon in 1999 and has been found in neighboring Canada. It's a European beetle. It first made its entry into Eastern North America about 1962, and then made the jump to Western North America in 1982. And as shown in the next slide or so, it demonstrated relentless spread in its presence. Next slide, please. In this slide, what you'll see is the spread of the beetle starting in the Ohio region in the early 60s, working its way across a number of eastern states, and then starting again in 1982, made its jump into Utah and Montana, and then moved through Idaho into Oregon and Washington. And again, this beetle is very capable of moving on its own, hitchhiking, and so on. And this is what brought about the spread of the beetle. In this case, it really wasn't directly human-aided. Next slide, please. And in this picture, we see the adult beetle on the left. On the right, we see the eggs that are laid. And then on the lower portion of the slide, we see the beetle larvae that look a little bit slug-like, that feed on leaves of cereal grains, oats, wheat, things like that. They tend to skeletonize the leaves and, of course, are not helpful to the plant at all. Next slide, please. Here again is the beetle larva, and again, they, to most people, would kind of resemble a slug, but this is the beetle larva. Next slide, please. The reason this particular insect has been successfully dealt with in this country is because of natural enemies. In this particular case, you see the cereal leaf beetle larva, and this is then a parasitic wasp that will lay eggs in that larva and end up killing it. And then we also have another wasp that lays its eggs into the eggs of the cereal leaf beetle. And between these two parasitic wasps, which focus on cereal leaf beetle, we've managed to reduce the problem in many respects. Next slide, please. Here's a Washington State University publication having to do with the cereal leaf beetle here. And again, we've been very successful because what we did is in about 2002 or so, I went down to Utah and met with the people there and was able to collect parasitized cereal leaf beetle larvae. We brought them back. They were run through the quarantine facility at Washington State University. The parasitic wasps were collected and cultured, and then we were able to turn loose parasitic wasps on the cereal leaf beetles in this state just about as soon as they entered the state. And so we were fortunately kind of right on top of the situation, and that has led to really quite a good, successful biological control program. Next slide, please. And similar to the situation described earlier for Phytophthora amorum, we also, of course, pay a lot of attention to Alaska with regard to movement of pests. And so, again, in the early 2000s, we did some surveys for cereal leaf beetle in some of the cereal grain growing areas of Alaska. And again, fortunately, we've had no evidence of it making its way into Alaska, even though there are pathways by which it could happen. Next slide, please. So I've been able to briefly cover 4 successful situations where we've been able to deal with introduced pests and keep them from becoming either established in this state or from becoming a serious long-term problem. And there's been a variety of methods used to do that, but again, they have been success stories. So be glad to take any questions you might have. Thank you.